The fog clung to the river like a muffled whisper as night settled over the city, and Kate walked along the quay with her coat pulled tight against the damp intimation of rain that never quite came, the Thames breathing steam between the lampposts and the distant hum of late buses. She wasn't meant to be here. Not tonight. Not in this weather that felt almost like a day from the city itself. But there was a pull she couldn't resist. A pull that felt more like a promise she'd once made to someone she had lost or perhaps never truly found. The invitation she'd received lay in her pocket. Not a note, but a memory she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. A voice she believed she'd dreamed speaking to her from a corner of the world that wasn't quite real, telling her to meet at the location only she and a long-ago spectre would know. The invitation had carried the scent of rain and old leather and a map drawn with a trembling hand, and for reasons she wouldn't admit aloud, she had followed it, as if faith itself could be bought with the sort of fear that tightened her chest in the starlight. A figure appeared at the end of the jetty, tall, wrapped in a coat that seemed to have absorbed every airless hour of London fog, with a hat tilted just so and eyes that looked both wary and familiar, as though he lived in a dream she'd once tried to recall upon waking. He stepped forward and held out a gloved hand as if this were a perfectly ordinary greeting, and not a crossing of some invisible threshold. "You found me," he said, his voice the kind of warm growl that makes the air taste of smoke and cinnamon. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but the sound stuck in her throat, tight as a knot of wet linen. "I did what I was told," she managed, which was not quite the truth, since what she'd been told hadn't been spoken aloud, only implied in a hush between two halves of a memory she wasn't ready to admit belonged to him. They walked along the river together, a pair of strangers who moved with the ease of dancers who had learned their steps in shadows. The city wore its night like a velvet cloak, and every window contained a fragment of a story someone would tell when the clock struck a certain hour and the lights reflected off the water in a way that made the world look suddenly cinematic. They passed a narrow alley where the air smelled of damp brick and something sweeter, a scent that tugged at Kate's nerves with a memory she couldn't place. He spoke softly about the places a person could go if they learned to listen to the stories the city refused to tell openly, about bridges that would only show their better side if you believed hard enough, about a theater hidden beneath a disabled warehouse where the audience gathered in the dark to watch dreams perform themselves in real time. She listened, the words threading through her as if they were notes on a battered piano, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, the hollow ache that had lived inside her begin to fill with something almost unscarred, almost brave. They reached a disused churchyard where the tombstones wore names like whispers and the ground kept its secrets in a cadence of crumbling stone. The man paused, glanced around as though the night itself might betray them, then produced a small brass key from his coat pocket and pressed it into Kate's hand with a smile that seemed almost dangerous in its tenderness. "3 doors," he said. "3 rooms you must pass to learn the truth you've never let yourself say aloud. The first is a room of echoes, the second a room of faces, the third a room where time forgets to move." His saturnine grin suggested a joke he would not let her finish, and she felt a chill as if a cold breath had passed over the back of her neck. "Why should I trust you?" she whispered, though she knew the answer lay somewhere in the tiny tremor of his fingers against hers, in the way the corners of his mouth trembled with what looked like fear and longing in equal measure. "Because fear can be a compass," he replied, "and love a lantern, if you're brave enough to hold them both." They stepped into the churchyard, where a path lay beneath a canopy of ivy and the moon managed to carve silver into the edges of the gravestones. The air smelled of rain on old stone, of rain that had fallen in the past and left a memory behind in every gutter and corner. The first door used to be a sanctuary, but now it hung askew on its hinges, and the brass key turned with a sigh as if the door itself remembered a different life. Inside, the room echoed with their footsteps and a chorus of their own voices speaking simultaneously, neither one sure which of them was saying the words aloud and which existed only in the other's echo. The walls bore damp patterns that looked like constellations she'd never learned to read, and in the center stood a mirror tall enough to swallow a person whole, its surface clouded with the breath of forgotten winters. When she looked into it, she saw not herself but a girl she used to be, a version of her she had buried under years of practicality and polite smiles and the quiet certainty that happiness was something you studied from a distance, never chased. The man stood behind her, his breath warm on the back of her neck as the air in the room grew strange and thick, as if the atmosphere had decided to dream rather than merely exist. "Tell me your secret," he murmured, and his words were not a demand but an invitation, a dare to admit what she had kept locked away for far too long. In the mirror, the girl looked back with eyes that knew more than Kate wanted to admit, eyes that carried a smear of a past she'd tried to forget, the night she'd run from a room where a choice had been made for her, a choice that had ended with a broken heart and a longing that never truly faded. Kate turned, but the man had vanished from her sight. In his place, a shadow figure stood at the edge of the doorframe, watching, waiting, as if the room itself were listening to the memories they dared not reveal in daylight. The second door proved trickier, marked by faces that kept shifting behind their hands, as if the subjects of the memory were not yet ready to show themselves to the light. They stepped through into another chamber where a circle of old portraits hung, each one a still moment of someone who had lived and then disappeared into the same fog they now shared. A voice spoke from the air, barely more than a whisper, the sort of sound that might belong to a wind that travels through church windows or a memory that suddenly becomes present. It told them a story of a vanished love, a tale of two people who almost found each other in London once, only for fear or circumstance to pull them apart again and again, until all that remained were these portraits and a room that wouldn't let them forget that love, once mistaken as lost, could be reframed as something still breathing, if one was willing to listen to the right sort of echo. They held on to each other, the touch between them becoming a lifeline and a dare. They would not surrender the growing warmth between them just because a ghost of the past decided to stroke their wrists with chilly fingers and remind them of what pain had taught them to fear. In the third chamber, time slowed to a patient, almost dangerous ease. The room was filled with a soft, warm light, a mood that suggested a lover's retreat rather than a trap, and a single chair stood before a short, arched doorway through which a corridor stretched flickering with candlelight. The man guided Kate toward the chair and spoke into her ear with a tenderness that braided itself through fear and desire. "Sit," he urged gently, "and tell me what you fear most about loving again." She sat, shoulders loosening as the fear loosened its grip, and she spoke softly about the sting of betrayal, about the way hope had felt like a dangerous thing to hold because it sometimes came with a price too high to pay. He listened, and when she finished, he told her a truth she'd forgotten she'd learned in a time when she'd believed in nothing but survival. Love isn't a flawless idea, but a persistent choice, a decision you make again and again, especially when the world seems to be closing in with its rain and its shadows. The door at the far end of the corridor opened onto an ordinary street, though the drizzle had begun again, giving the bricks a wash of silver and making the city's glass towers look as if they were winking with mischief. The man walked out first, and Kate followed, leaving the echo of the rooms behind with a sense of relief and a tremor of anticipation she couldn't name. The night outside was cooler, the air tasting of rain and possibility, and the street felt less like a trap and more like a stage where she could perform a version of herself she'd always wanted to become but hadn't dared to try. The man turned toward her with that same half-smile, and in that moment the fear and longing aligned, not erased but integrated, as if they could coexist the way childhood and adulthood coexisted in the same body, the same breath. "Do you want to go home?" he asked, though home was a concept that had shifted for both of them between the rooms and the river and the gate with its stubborn hinge. "Or do you want to walk the city with me a little longer, letting the rain and the night rewrite what we thought we knew about each other?" High answer mattered more than any plot twist could, and she found it in the space between his words and the way his eyes softened when he said her name in a way that turned the sound into a punctuation mark, a gentle full stop on a sentence that had started with a breath and would continue with a heartbeat. They moved together through the streets, the city wrapping around them like a story that had finally found its voice, and though the night was thick with whispers about past lovers and missed chances and the kind of truth that hurts before it heals, their steps kept time with something brave and odd and almost dangerous, the certainty that they might be the exact pair who could mend what was broken, if they allowed themselves to be present for the length of a single night, and then a second, and perhaps a third, until the dawn came with a soft, forgiving light. When dawn finally approached, they found themselves back at the river, where the fog clung to the water as if clinging to the possibility of a different ending. They spoke of the rooms as if they were chapters in a book they would write together, not to escape but to understand, not to escape the pain of what came before but to choose differently this time. The rain let go in a hush, and the city's rhythm slowed to a careful, intimate tempo, as though the world itself were listening for the next line in their story. The final moment arrived not with a declaration but with a promise woven into a look, a quiet agreement that they would walk forward with caution, with openness, with the courage to confess what they might fear to say aloud but would still carry in their hearts. They kissed then, not in a fever of passion but in a measured, healing cadence that felt more like a vow than a gesture. The kiss tasted of rain and relief and something like forgiveness, toward each other and toward the selves they'd carried for years, toward the ghosts that had haunted their nights and toward the bright possibility of a future that could be both tender and true. As they parted at the edge of the bridge and exchanged names that could pass for promises, the city exhaled, the fog thinning, and the river catching the first pale light of morning in its silver throat. He walked away toward the terrace of a cafe where it would be possible to forget fear for a while, and she followed with a step that felt newly assured, as if the old version of herself had finally learned to stand down so the new one could rise. The tale she carried back to her apartment that day was no longer just a fearsome night with a haunted invitation. It was a map of a love that refused to be hurried, a suspenseful romance painted against a London dawn, a story that said, in a quiet yet insistent voice, that heartbreak can give way to a tenderness strong enough to hold two people through whatever shadows the city might conjure tomorrow. And if the city held more secrets than a single night could reveal, well, that was a truth worth wondering for, a truth worth waiting for, a truth that could begin again every time rain began and when two people chose to walk the same path, side by side, into whatever night still waited beyond the bend. The city settled into a nocturne of rain-soaked silhouettes and the soft thud of footsteps on wet pavements as they walked side by side along the riverbank, the dawn still a rumor on the horizon but a promise they both wanted to meet halfway. Aidan kept one eye on the fading fog and another on the warmth of Kate's presence beside him, feeling the old tension between fear and longing loosen its grip, as if the night itself had decided to lend them a gentler hand. They spoke in hushed tones, not of grand gestures but of small decisions, where to turn, which cafe to return to when the rain picked up again, which memories could be carried forward without becoming heavy ballast. Aidan's breath fogged in the cold air, and when Kate offered him a smile that felt almost conspiratorial, he realized that the fear he'd once treated as a compass might now be navigated with trust, with the quiet certainty that she'd choose him even when every route looked uncertain. As they crossed Westminster Bridge, a distant foghorn mourned somewhere beyond the river, and for a moment the city seemed to pause with them, as if it too was listening for the next line in their evolving script. They found a door in a long-neglected building, a remnant of a theater that had once welcomed dreamers and nightmares with equal fervor, and behind it lay a staircase spiraling down into a vaulted space where the walls wore damp velvet, and the air tasted faintly of old stage smoke and rain. The air crackled with a kind of electric expectation, and Kate reached for Aidan's hand, not in need but in ritual, as though continuity could be forged by shed breath, and the promise of knowing one another better in the intimacy of a place that remembered every whisper that had ever crossed its threshold. The basement room held a single chair beneath a pool of pale light, A projector stood like a sentinel, its reel waiting to breathe life into a forgotten film they hadn't planned to show the world, but perhaps needed to see themselves. They began filming again, not for an audience but for each other, speaking their truths in the rhythms of a documentary they were making about trust, vulnerability, and the hush between desire and fear. Kate spoke softly into the camera about the night she'd believed she'd lost herself to a past that would always define her, and how meeting Aiden here, in this city that kept time with rain, had begun to carve out a future she could lean into. Aiden answered with a clarity that surprised even him, admitting that his habit of keeping walls intact had never felt so brittle as when she stood close enough to melt them away. The camera rolled without fanfare, capturing the way their eyes lingered before they spoke, the way their fingers found each other again when the lens wasn't watching, the small, almost unnoticeable shifts in their posture that said they were learning to inhabit a shared space without stepping on each other's fears. The pair decide to stage a live sequence, a test of whether their bond can survive public gaze without dissolving into spectacle. They choose a street near the Covent Garden Piazza, where lamps glow amber and pedestrians move with a music all their own. Aiden narrates in voiceover, a calm, measured cadence that makes the city feel intimate rather than vast. Two strangers under one umbrella, learning not to fear the rain but to dance with it. Kate adds her own line, a soft defiance that feels like a spell spoken aloud, and sometimes the storm reveals the people we were always meant to become. A street performer switches to a minor key piece as they walk, the music wrapping around them like a veil of possibility. They film a sequence where passers-by react to the moment, the way a cyclist glimpses them through the rain, the way a child presses their hands to the window of a coffee shop, the way a couple on a bench share a stolen kiss in the drizzle. Each reaction becomes part of the story they are telling, but the story remains theirs to own, not to perform. As the night deepens, the echo of the earlier rooms, the doors and the memories, return, but now they are refracted through a softened lens. Aiden and Kate discover a hidden courtyard behind a bookshop, a little oasis of bricks and ivy that seems to exist out of time. The space invites them to lay aside the camera for a while and simply be present. They talk about the future in terms of small rituals, morning tea at a corner cafe, a weekend walk along the river, a shared notebook where they write down stray lines that could become scenes in a longer project. The vulnerability in their voices grows, not as a loud confession but as a quiet willingness to be seen, completely, even when the gaze from the world might be judging or misreading what they are building together. The more they reveal, the lighter their steps become, as though shedding old fears allows the body to move with the ease of rain on stone. Towards the middle of the stretch, a twist arises in the form of a message from a gallery owner who'd seen fragments of their earlier work and now proposes a public installation, an immersive walkthrough experience where visitors move through rooms that echo the three doors from the churchyard, each room offering a different facet of love and risk. The invitation is exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. It promises validation but also the possibility that their private windings could be exposed to daylight and critical eyes. They debate the offer, weighing the allure of a larger audience against the comfort of their own sanctuary. In the end, they decide that the essence of their story lies in the honest, human moments, the glances, the steadiness of a shared breath, the warmth of a hand finding another in a crowd, and that some parts of their love deserve to be seen, while others must stay carefully shielded. They resolve to curate the project with care, to separate the intimate chapters from the public ones, preserving the sanctity of the moments that belong to them and theirs alone. The night threat looms not as a villain but as a test, the fear that the city's lights might flicker in a way that reveals more than they are ready to reveal. A sudden downpour returns, heavier than before, and the couple find shelter beneath the eaves of a narrow archway, where rain pelts the stones and the world outside becomes a monochrome cinema reel. They lean into each other, sharing warmth and silence, letting the rain beat out a rhythm that steadies their nerves. In this shared shelter, they neither hurry nor pretend. They simply exist, listening to the city's heart beating in time with their own. When the rain eases, they step back into the street with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever comes next. The splash of neon, the rustle of autumn leaves, the distant chimes of a clock tower, together. The dawn begins to tint the horizon, a pale gold that makes the river look like molten glass. They return to the riverbank where their story first began, or rather where the next chapter begins to take form. They speak in measured, hopeful tones, acknowledging the scars they carry and the strength they've found in each other's company.